My brother called me the family loser while bragging to his business partners about his upcoming $1 million construction deal. What he didn't know was that I'm the city planning director who controls every single permit his company needs. By the time I was done with him, he learned exactly who the real loser was. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'm Jessica Martinez, and at 32 years old, I've worked my way up to become the youngest city planning director in Riverside County's history. It wasn't luck or connections that got me here. It was 15 years of grinding through late nights, weekend shifts, and more municipal law courses than anyone should ever have to take. Growing up in Mesa Verde, a mid-sized city about 40 minutes east of Los Angeles, I was always the responsible one. While other kids were at parties or hanging out at the mall, I was studying for my advanced placement classes or working part-time at the local library to save money for college. My parents, Maria and Roberto Martinez, owned a small landscaping business that kept us comfortable but never wealthy. Dad would wake up at 5 in the morning to tend to clients' yards before the heat became unbearable, while Mom handled the books and customer relations from our kitchen table. My younger brother Diego was 3 years behind me and couldn't have been more different if we'd been raised in separate households. Where I was methodical and focused, Diego was impulsive and charismatic. He had this natural ability to charm people, to make them believe whatever he was selling at any given moment. Teachers loved him, despite his mediocre grades, girls flocked to him, despite his lack of ambition, and our parents constantly made excuses for his failures while holding me to impossible standards. After high school, I earned a full scholarship to UC Riverside, where I double majored in urban planning and public administration. I spent my summers interning at various city offices, learning the intricate web of regulations, zoning laws, and permit processes that keep communities functioning. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly filing documents, attending mind-numbing committee meetings, and helping residents navigate bureaucratic mazes, but I found something deeply satisfying about creating order from chaos. Diego, meanwhile, dropped out of community college after one semester and bounced between jobs like a pinball. He sold cars for 6 months until he got caught inflating trade-in values. He tried his hand at restaurant management, but quit when he realized it actually required managing people instead of just telling them what to do. For a brief period, he convinced our parents to let him help expand their landscaping business, but that ended when they discovered he'd been using company credit cards for personal expenses. Through it all, our parents treated Diego's failures as temporary setbacks while expecting me to excel at everything. When I graduated summa cum laude and landed my first job as an assistant planner for the city of Mesa Verde, Mom's response was, "That's nice, Mia, but when are you going to find a husband?" When Diego got fired from his third job in 2 years, she worried about his self-esteem and cooked his favorite meals to cheer him up. I started at the bottom of the municipal hierarchy, processing routine permits for deck additions and fence installations. The work was tedious, but I approached it with the same intensity I'd brought to my studies. I memorized every code, regulation, and ordinance in our municipal handbook. I stayed late to help contractors understand complex requirements, earned a reputation for fairness and thoroughness, and gradually took on more complex projects. After 3 years as an assistant planner, I was promoted to senior planner, overseeing commercial development projects. This meant working with business owners, architects, and construction companies on everything from strip mall renovations to major retail developments. I learned to navigate the political complexities of local government, building relationships with city council members, attending public hearings, and balancing community concerns with economic development needs. Diego, during this same period, had discovered what he called his entrepreneurial spirit. This mostly involved half-baked business ideas that lasted just long enough to separate our parents from their savings. He tried to start a food truck business but never obtained the proper permits and got shut down after 2 weeks. He launched a house-flipping venture with money borrowed from Dad, but his first and only project was a disaster that ended up costing more in repairs than the house was worth. Despite these repeated failures, Diego had an uncanny ability to convince people that his next idea would be different. He'd show up at family gatherings with polished presentations, slick business cards, and infectious enthusiasm that made even skeptical relatives nod along with his schemes. He had this way of making his failures sound like learning experiences, and his setbacks seem like temporary obstacles that only proved his resilience. When I was 28, the city planning director position opened up unexpectedly. The previous director had accepted a job with the county, leaving a vacancy that would normally be filled by someone with decades more experience than I had. I debated whether to even apply, knowing that several senior planners with impressive resumes would be competing for the role. But I'd spent 7 years building relationships throughout the department and earning the respect of city council members who'd seen me present dozens of development proposals. I shepherded controversial projects through contentious public hearings, found creative solutions to complex zoning challenges, and developed a reputation as someone who could balance competing interests while keeping projects moving forward. The interview process was grueling. Multiple rounds with the city council, presentations to department heads, and scenario-based questions that tested both my technical knowledge and leadership abilities. When they offered me the position, I was stunned. At 20, I was responsible for overseeing all development in Mesa Verde, managing a staff of 12 planners and inspectors, and serving as the final authority on permits for everything from backyard pools to major commercial developments. Diego's reaction to my promotion was predictably dismissive. At the family barbecue where I announced my new role, he laughed and said, "It must be nice to have a government job where you can't get fired." When I explained that I'd be overseeing millions of dollars worth of development projects, he shrugged and said, "Yeah, but it's not like you're actually building anything or creating real value." Our parents were proud in their way, but they seemed more confused than impressed. They understood that I had an important job with the city, but the specifics of urban planning and development oversight might as well have been rocket science to them. They were more excited when Diego announced his latest venture, a construction company he was starting with two partners he'd met through a friend of a friend. Diego's new business, Southwest Premier Construction, was supposed to specialize in high-end residential developments. His partners, Marcus Chen and Ryan Thompson, brought construction experience and financial backing, while Diego contributed what he called his vision and connections. From what I could tell, this mostly meant he was good at talking to potential clients and making everything sound more impressive than it actually was. For the first time in his adult life, Diego seemed genuinely focused on something. He spent hours studying construction techniques, attending networking events, and developing relationships with suppliers and subcontractors. Southwest Premier landed their first few contracts, modest home renovations and small commercial build-outs, and actually completed them successfully. As Diego's business grew, so did his confidence and his tendency to embellish his role in its success. At family gatherings, he'd regale anyone who'd listen with stories about his construction empire, dropping hints about major projects in the works and million-dollar deals on the horizon. He started dressing differently, trading his usual jeans and polo shirts for expensive suits and designer watches that seemed far beyond what a small construction company could afford. The change in how our family treated Diego was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, he was the successful entrepreneur, the one with vision and ambition, while I was just another government bureaucrat pushing papers around. Mom would beam with pride when Diego talked about his business, asking detailed questions about his projects, and bragging to her friends about her son, the construction company owner. During one particularly memorable Sunday dinner, Diego was holding court at the table, describing a potential contract that would transform the Mesa Verde skyline and establish Southwest Premier as a major player in regional development. He was gesturing expansively, talking about architectural innovations and economic impact, when he noticed me quietly eating my meal. "You know what your problem is, Jess," he said, pointing his fork in my direction. "You've gotten comfortable being a small fish in a small pond. You're content to just maintain the status quo instead of actually creating something meaningful." I looked up from my plate, meeting his eyes across the table. "I think there's value in making sure developments follow proper procedures and serve the community's interests." Diego laughed, shaking his head. "See, that's exactly what I mean. You're so focused on rules and regulations that you can't see the bigger picture. Successful people don't worry about every little permit and procedure. They find ways to get things done." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Diego's words stuck with me, not because they hurt. I'd long since stopped caring about his opinions of my career, but because they revealed how little he understood about the world he was trying to operate in. Diego saw permits and regulations as obstacles to circumvent rather than safeguards that protected communities and ensured quality development. What he didn't realize was that his dismissive attitude toward the regulatory process was about to become a very expensive problem. 6 months into my tenure as planning director, I'd settled into a routine that I genuinely enjoyed. My days were filled with reviewing development proposals, meeting with architects and contractors, and working through the complex puzzle of urban growth. Mesa Verde was experiencing a construction boom, with new residential developments sprouting up on the outskirts of town and commercial projects breathing fresh life into our downtown district. My office overlooked the main plaza, where I could watch the daily rhythm of city life unfold below. Construction crews would arrive before dawn to beat the desert heat, delivery trucks navigated narrow streets to supply local businesses, and by evening, families would stroll through the newly renovated park with its updated playground and improved lighting. Projects that had crossed my desk and required careful coordination between multiple departments. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the satisfaction of seeing plans transform into tangible improvements for our community. Every approved permit represented jobs for local workers, homes for growing families, or services that would benefit residents for decades to come. I took pride in maintaining high standards while keeping projects moving efficiently through the approval process. Diego's construction company, meanwhile, was gaining momentum in ways that both impressed and concerned me. Southwest Premier had moved from small renovation projects to larger commercial contracts, including a restaurant renovation downtown and a small office complex on the north side of town. Their work quality was solid, and they'd built a reputation for completing projects on schedule and within budget. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. But there were warning signs that made me increasingly uncomfortable. During a routine permit review, I noticed that Southwest Premier had submitted applications for electrical work that seemed beyond the scope of their listed qualifications. When I called Diego to clarify some technical specifications, he brushed off my questions with a casual confidence that felt more like ignorance than expertise. "Don't worry about all that bureaucratic stuff, Jess," he said, during one particularly frustrating phone conversation. "We've got everything under control. My partners know what they're doing, and we're not going to let paperwork slow us down." The problem was that paperwork wasn't just bureaucratic busy work. It was a carefully designed system to ensure safety, quality, and compliance with building codes that protected both workers and future occupants. When contractors cut corners on permits or tried to rush through inspections, the results could be catastrophic. I started paying closer attention to Southwest Premier's permit applications, not because I wanted to create problems for Diego, but because I had a professional obligation to ensure all contractors operating in Mesa Verde met the same standards. What I discovered made my stomach drop. Their most recent project, a strip mall renovation on Maple Street, had multiple code violations that should have been caught during the initial review process. The electrical work didn't meet current safety standards, the plumbing modifications hadn't been properly inspected, and they'd made structural changes without submitting updated architectural plans. Any one of these issues could result in serious safety hazards or expensive remediation work down the line. I scheduled a meeting with Marcus Chen, Diego's business partner, who handled the technical aspects of their projects. Marcus arrived at my office looking nervous, clutching a folder of documents and glancing around my office like he was afraid of being ambushed. "Look, Miss Martinez," he began before I could even explain why I'd called the meeting. "I know there might be some irregularities with our recent submissions, but we're a growing company and sometimes the paperwork doesn't keep up with the actual work." I leaned back in my chair, studying his expression. "Marcus, these aren't minor paperwork issues. You've got electrical installations that violate current code requirements and structural modifications that were never approved. This isn't about paperwork lagging behind. This is about work being done without proper permits." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, opening his folder and shuffling through papers without really looking at them. "Diego said you'd work with us on this stuff, since you're family. He told us you understood that sometimes contractors need flexibility to get jobs done efficiently." The conversation revealed a troubling pattern. Diego had been telling his partners that his sister's position would give Southwest Premier certain advantages in the permit process. He'd implied that family connections would allow them to cut corners or receive preferential treatment that other contractors couldn't access. Marcus, I said carefully, my relationship with Diego doesn't change the fact that every contractor in Mesa Verde has to follow the same rules. If anything, I have to be more careful about conflicts of interest, not less careful. After Marcus left, looking considerably more worried than when he'd arrived, I realized I was facing an impossible situation. Either I enforced the same standards for Diego's company that I applied to every other contractor, which would likely result in significant delays and costs for Southwest Premier, or I compromised my professional integrity and potentially put public safety at risk. That evening, I called Diego to discuss what I'd learned about their permit violations. The conversation went exactly as badly as I'd expected. Jesus, Jess, you're really going to bust my balls over some technicalities. Diego's voice carried a mixture of frustration and disbelief. We're talking about minor issues that can be fixed during the next inspection cycle. These aren't minor issues, Diego. You've got electrical work that doesn't meet code and structural changes that were never approved. This is serious stuff that could affect the safety of the building's occupants. Come on, you know we're not going to build anything unsafe. Marcus has been doing electrical work for 15 years. Just because some bureaucrat in City Hall decided to change the rules doesn't mean our work is suddenly dangerous. The casual dismissal of building codes as arbitrary rule changes revealed how fundamentally Diego misunderstood the regulatory process. These weren't bureaucratic whims, they were carefully developed standards based on decades of experience, technological advances, and sometimes tragic failures that had cost lives. Diego, I can't give you special treatment just because we're related. Actually, I have to be even more careful to avoid any appearance of favoritism. You need to bring your projects into compliance with current codes. There was a long pause before Diego responded, and when he did, his voice had taken on a cold edge. I rarely heard from him. You know what, Jess? I always knew you were jealous of my success, but I didn't think you'd actually sabotage your own brother's business.
I'm not sabotaging anything.
I'm doing my job and enforcing the same standards that apply to every contractor in the city. Your job is supposed to help businesses succeed, not create roadblocks that cost us time and money. But I guess that's the difference between people who build things and people who just push papers around all day. The conversation ended with Diego hanging up on me, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering how a routine compliance issue had escalated into a family conflict. But the personal drama didn't change my professional responsibilities, and over the next few weeks, I had to make some difficult decisions about Southwest Premier's projects. The Maple Street renovation was red-tagged, meaning all work had to stop until the code violations were corrected. This required Southwest Premier to hire a licensed electrician to redo the electrical work, bring in a structural engineer to approve their modifications, and pay for additional inspections once the corrections were completed. The delays and additional costs were significant, and I knew Diego blamed me personally for what he saw as unnecessary harassment. Family dinners became increasingly tense affairs. Diego would make pointed comments about government overreach and the way bureaucrats stifled entrepreneurship with needless regulation. Our parents, who didn't fully understand the technical issues involved, seemed confused by the conflict between their children but generally sided with Diego's interpretation that I was being unreasonably strict. Mija, Mom said to me after one particularly uncomfortable Sunday meal, Diego is trying so hard to build something for his future. Maybe you could find a way to help him instead of making things more difficult. I tried to explain that ensuring code compliance was actually helping Diego in the long run, that cutting corners might seem cost-effective initially, but could lead to much more expensive problems later. But my explanation sounded legalistic and cold compared to Diego's passionate speeches about pursuing the American dream and overcoming government obstacles. The situation reached a breaking point when Southwest Premier submitted plans for their biggest project yet, a mixed-use development that would include retail space, offices, and luxury condominiums. The project represented a major step up in scale and complexity for Diego's company, and the profit margins would be substantial if they could execute it successfully. But as I reviewed their preliminary submissions, I realized that Southwest Premier was attempting to undertake a project that was far beyond their demonstrated capabilities. The architectural plans were incomplete, the engineering specifications were inadequate, and several aspects of the proposed development didn't comply with current zoning requirements for that area of the city. I was going to have to reject their application, and I knew that Diego would see it as the ultimate betrayal. The Sunset Ridge development proposal landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by a courier service in a leather portfolio that screamed an expensive presentation. The project was ambitious beyond anything Southwest Premier had attempted before, a 40-unit luxury condominium complex with ground-floor retail space and underground parking, situated on 12 acres of prime real estate overlooking the valley. As I spread the architectural renderings across my conference table, I had to admit the project looked impressive. The buildings were designed in a contemporary southwestern style that would complement Mesa Verde's aesthetic, with careful attention to landscaping and natural drainage patterns. On paper, it was exactly the kind of development our city council had been hoping to attract: upscale housing that would bring in affluent residents and increase our tax base. But as I dug into the technical specifications, problems emerged immediately. The soil analysis was outdated by 3 years, based on tests conducted before the area had experienced significant rainfall that could have altered ground stability. The traffic impact study completely ignored the elementary school 3 blocks away, failing to account for increased congestion during drop-off and pickup times. Most critically, the proposed building heights exceeded zoning restrictions for that area by nearly 15 feet. I spent the rest of the week conducting a thorough review, consulting with our city engineer, the fire department, and the school district. Each conversation revealed additional complications that would need to be addressed before the project could move forward. The development would require a zone variance, updated environmental assessments, and significant modifications to the proposed design. By Friday afternoon, I had compiled a 12-page letter detailing the deficiencies in Southwest Premier's application. It wasn't a rejection, it was a request for additional information and revisions that would address the identified concerns. In the development world, this was standard procedure for complex projects, but I knew Diego wouldn't see it that way. I was right. My phone rang within an hour of the courier delivering my response to Southwest Premier's office. "Are you out of your fucking mind?" Diego's voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. 12 pages of bullshit requirements for a project that's going to bring millions of dollars in investment to this dead-end town. "Diego, these aren't arbitrary requirements. Your soil analysis is 3 years old. Your traffic study doesn't account for the school zone, and your building heights violate current zoning restrictions. These are legitimate issues that need to be addressed." Legitimate issues? You're killing a $40 million development over paperwork technicalities. Do you have any idea how many jobs this project would create? How much tax revenue would it generate? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice professional. I understand the economic benefits, but that doesn't change the fact that the application is incomplete. If you address the concerns I've outlined, we can move forward with the approval process. If we address your concerns, it'll add 6 months and $500,000 to the project timeline. Our investors aren't going to wait around while you play power games with your brother's business. The accusation stung because it was so unfair. I'd spent more time reviewing Southwest Premier's application than I normally would for a project of this size, precisely because I wanted to give Diego every opportunity to succeed. I'd consulted with additional experts, researched comparable developments in neighboring cities, and even stayed late to ensure my response was thorough and constructive. This isn't about power games, Diego. It's about ensuring that developments meet safety and quality standards. If another contractor submitted the same application, they'd receive the same response. Bullshit. You're using your position to sabotage my business because you can't stand seeing me succeed. You've always been jealous that I'm actually building something while you just sit behind a desk shuffling papers. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Diego accusing me of everything from professional incompetence to deliberate sabotage. He hung up after declaring that he was going to find another way to get this project approved and warning me that I was making a mistake I'd regret. The following Monday, I received an unexpected visit from City Councilman Robert Harrison, a local businessman who'd served on the council for over a decade. Bob was generally supportive of development projects and had been a vocal advocate for attracting upscale housing to Mesa Verde. "Jessica, I wanted to talk to you about this Sunset Ridge development," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I've been hearing some concerns about delays in the approval process. I wasn't surprised that Diego had reached out to council members. It was a legitimate part of the political process, and developers often sought support from elected officials when they felt their projects weren't receiving fair treatment. The application has some significant deficiencies that need to be addressed before we can move forward, I explained, handing Bob a copy of my response letter. These are standard requirements for a project of this size and complexity. Bob skimmed through the document, nodding thoughtfully. These all seem reasonable to me. Has the developer indicated they're unwilling to address these issues? They're concerned about the timeline and cost implications, but these aren't unreasonable requests. Any competent developer should be able to provide updated studies and revised plans. Well, I trust your judgment on the technical requirements, Bob said, standing to leave. Just wanted to make sure we weren't creating unnecessary obstacles for legitimate development. After Bob left, I felt cautiously optimistic that the political pressure would remain manageable. But that optimism was short-lived. Over the next 2 weeks, I received visits from 2 other council members, each expressing concern about the Sunset Ridge project delays. The conversations were polite and professional, but the message was clear. There was growing political interest in seeing this project move forward quickly. The pressure intensified when I learned that Diego had been giving interviews to the local newspaper, positioning himself as a victim of government overreach. The Mesa Verde Tribune ran a front-page story titled, "Local Developer Battles City Bureaucracy," featuring quotes from Diego about how excessive regulations were stifling economic growth and driving businesses away from Mesa Verde. "We're trying to bring jobs and investment to this community, but we're being blocked by outdated rules and inflexible bureaucrats who don't understand the realities of modern development," Diego was quoted as saying. The article included a photograph of him standing in front of the proposed development site, gesturing toward the empty land with an expression of frustrated determination. What bothered me most wasn't the public criticism. I'd dealt with that before from developers who didn't get their way. It was the way Diego was deliberately mischaracterizing the situation, making it sound like I was blocking the project entirely, rather than simply requiring compliance with existing standards. The situation came to a head during the next city council meeting, where Sunset Ridge was added to the agenda as a discussion item. Diego had mobilized supporters to attend the meeting, including several local business owners who spoke passionately about the need for economic development and the dangers of excessive regulation. Marcus Chen addressed the council on behalf of Southwest Premier, presenting a polished PowerPoint presentation that emphasized the project's economic benefits while downplaying the technical deficiencies I'd identified. He spoke eloquently about their company's track record and commitment to quality construction, carefully avoiding any mention of the code violations on their previous projects. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself in the uncomfortable position of defending legitimate regulatory requirements against emotional appeals for economic growth. I explained the specific concerns with the application, the importance of updated studies and compliance with zoning restrictions, and the standard process for addressing deficiencies in development proposals. But I could see from the council members' expressions that my technical explanations weren't resonating as strongly as the passionate appeals for jobs and investment. The political momentum was clearly building in favor of finding a way to expedite the Sunset Ridge approval, regardless of the procedural shortcuts that might require. After the meeting, Diego approached me in the parking lot, accompanied by his business partners and several supporters. His demeanor was different than I'd seen before, more confident, almost triumphant. "You see what's happening here, Jess," he said, loud enough for everyone around us to hear. "The community supports this project. The council supports this project. The only person standing in the way is you, and your days of blocking progress in this town are numbered." I looked around at the group of people staring at me, some with obvious hostility, and realized that Diego had successfully turned a routine regulatory review into a public relations battle. Worse, he was winning. The weeks following the city council meeting were among the most professionally challenging of my career. Diego had successfully shifted the narrative from technical compliance to economic opportunity, and I found myself increasingly isolated as the perceived obstacle to Mesa Verde's prosperity. Local business owners who had previously respected my work began treating me with barely concealed hostility, while city council members started scheduling meetings to discuss streamlining the development approval process. What made the situation even more frustrating was that Diego seemed to be enjoying every moment of my discomfort. He'd started showing up at City Hall regularly, not for official business but to network with other departments and build relationships with staff members who might be useful to his company. I'd catch glimpses of him in the hallways, shaking hands with building inspectors or chatting with zoning commissioners, always flashing that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. The breaking point came during our family's traditional Thanksgiving gathering. I'd been dreading the holiday for weeks, knowing that the entire extended family would be there and that Diego's recent success would dominate the conversation. But I underestimated just how thoroughly he'd prepared to use the occasion to humiliate me. The Martinez family Thanksgiving was always held at our cousin Elena's house, a sprawling ranch-style home in the hills overlooking Mesa Verde. Elena had married well, her husband owned several car dealerships across the region, and she took pride in hosting elaborate family gatherings that showcased their prosperity. This year's event was particularly well attended, with nearly 40 relatives crowding into the expansive living room and spilling out onto the covered patio. I arrived fashionably late, hoping to avoid the inevitable conversations about work and Diego's business success. But as soon as I walked through the front door, I could sense that something was different. Conversations paused when people saw me, and there were knowing glances exchanged among relatives who clearly knew something I didn't. My cousin Miguel pulled me aside almost immediately. "Hey Jess, I heard about what's going on with Diego's big development project. That's got to be weird, having to make decisions that affect your brother's business." Before I could respond, Uncle Fernando appeared with a beer in his hand and a concerned expression on his weathered face. "Mija, your mom told me you've been giving Diego a hard time about some permits or something. You know he's worked really hard to build that company, right?" The interrogation continued as I moved through the house, with various relatives expressing concern about the family conflict, and subtly suggesting that I should find a way to help Diego rather than create obstacles for him. It became clear that Diego had been working the family network for weeks, sharing his version of events and positioning himself as the victim of government overreach and sibling jealousy. The real performance began during dinner, when Diego stood up to make what he called a special announcement. He was dressed immaculately in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew he had a captive audience. "Before we dig into Elena's amazing feast," he began, raising his wine glass, "I wanted to share some exciting news with the family. Southwest Premier Construction has just secured the largest development contract in Mesa Verde's history, a $40 million luxury condominium project that will create over 200 jobs and bring millions in tax revenue to our community." The room erupted in applause and congratulations, with relatives rushing to embrace Diego and pepper him with questions about the project. He basked in the attention, describing the development in glowing terms and painting himself as a visionary entrepreneur who was single-handedly transforming Mesa Verde's economic landscape. But he wasn't finished. "Of course," Diego continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "we've faced some challenges getting this project approved. It's been frustrating dealing with city bureaucrats who seem more interested in creating obstacles than supporting local business growth." He paused, letting his gaze drift across the room until it settled on me. "Some people in government positions seem to think their job is to prevent things from happening, rather than helping our community prosper. They hide behind regulations and technicalities instead of looking at the bigger picture." I felt my face burning as every eye in the room turned toward me. Diego's meaning was unmistakable, and he was delivering his criticism with the perfect blend of disappointment and condescension that made me appear petty and obstructionist. "But I believe in the power of family and community," he continued, his voice rising with passion. "I believe that when good people work together, we can overcome any obstacle and achieve great things. This project is going to happen because Mesa Verde deserves better than the status quo. We deserve leaders who understand that progress requires courage, not just caution." The applause was thunderous, and I watched in horror as my own relatives nodded along with Diego's implicit criticism of my professional conduct. He had masterfully positioned himself as the optimistic entrepreneur fighting for community progress, while casting me as the small-minded bureaucrat standing in the way of prosperity. After dinner, The conversations continued in smaller groups scattered throughout the house. I found myself increasingly isolated as relatives who normally enjoyed catching up with me seemed reluctant to engage in extended conversations. When I did try to explain the legitimate regulatory concerns with Diego's project, their eyes would glaze over with boredom or polite skepticism. The final blow came when I overheard a conversation between my Aunt Carmen and several other relatives in the kitchen. They were discussing Diego's success and lamenting how sad it was that siblings sometimes couldn't support each other's achievements. "It's such a shame," Carmen was saying as she helped clear dishes. "Diego has worked so hard to build something meaningful, and instead of being proud of him, Jessica seems determined to tear him down. I always thought she was the smart one, but maybe book smarts aren't the same as wisdom." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Carmen had helped raise me after my grandmother died, and I'd always thought she understood my character better than most of the family. To hear her questioning not just my professional judgment, but my fundamental decency was devastating. I slipped out of the party without saying goodbye to anyone, driving home through empty streets while fighting back tears of frustration and humiliation. Diego had achieved something I wouldn't have thought possible. He'd turned my own family against me by portraying legitimate regulatory oversight as personal sabotage. The weekend after Thanksgiving brought a new level of public humiliation. The Mesa Verde Tribune ran a feature story about Southwest Premier's Sunset Ridge development, complete with architectural renderings and glowing quotes from local business leaders about the project's potential impact. The article portrayed Diego as a local success story, a homegrown entrepreneur whose vision was transforming the community. But buried in the middle of the article was a paragraph that made my stomach drop. "The project has faced delays in the city approval process, with some community members expressing frustration about what they see as excessive regulatory requirements that threaten to derail beneficial development." The story included a quote from Chamber of Commerce President Linda Walsh. "We need city officials who understand that economic growth requires partnership between government and business, not adversarial relationships that drive investment away from our community." While my name wasn't mentioned explicitly, anyone familiar with the situation would understand exactly who was being criticized. Diego had successfully built a public narrative that portrayed me as an obstructionist bureaucrat whose rigid interpretation of regulations was harming Mesa Verde's economic prospects. The professional impact was immediate and crushing. City Manager Patricia Reynolds called me into her office Monday morning, closing the door behind us with an expression that told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Jessica, I've been getting calls about the Sunset Ridge project," she began, settling behind her desk with a stack of papers. "Council members, business leaders, residents, everyone seems to have an opinion about how we're handling this development application." I tried to maintain my composure while explaining the legitimate regulatory concerns, but Patricia's body language told me she was more interested in political damage control than technical compliance. "I understand your position," she said when I finished, "but we need to find a way to move this project forward without creating the impression that Mesa Verde is hostile to development. Can you work with the applicant to expedite the approval process?" The message was clear. Find a way to approve Diego's project or face the consequences. My professional integrity and regulatory responsibilities were being sacrificed on the altar of political expediency, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The pressure to approve Diego's project was suffocating. Every day brought new reminders of my increasingly precarious position, from pointed comments during staff meetings to awkward encounters with city council members who seemed to view me as an obstacle to Mesa Verde's prosperity. I found myself second-guessing every decision, wondering if my commitment to regulatory compliance was really just stubborn pride disguised as professional integrity. It was during this period of self-doubt that I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified herself as Sandra Mitchell, a senior inspector with the California Department of Building Safety, and she was reaching out about some irregularities she'd discovered during a routine audit of construction projects across the region. "Miss Martinez, I'm reviewing compliance records for contractors operating in your jurisdiction, and I've noticed some concerning patterns with Southwest Premier Construction. Do you have a few minutes to discuss their recent projects?" My heart rate spiked immediately. "Of course. What kind of patterns are you seeing?" Sandra's voice was crisp and professional. "We've been conducting random site inspections of completed projects as part of a statewide safety initiative. During our review of Southwest Premier's work, we've identified multiple instances of non-compliance with state building codes, including some violations that pose serious safety risks. She went on to detail findings that made my blood run cold. The restaurant renovation downtown, the project Diego had pointed to as evidence of his company's quality work, had electrical installations that violated fire safety codes. The office complex on the north side of town had structural modifications that hadn't been properly engineered, creating potential collapse risks during seismic events. I'm forwarding you a comprehensive report with photographs and technical analysis, Sandra continued, but I wanted to give you a heads up because some of these violations appear to have been signed off on by your department's inspectors. After Sandra hung up, I sat in my office staring at my computer screen, waiting for her email to arrive. When it finally came, the attached report was even worse than I'd imagined. Page after page of documented violations, each accompanied by high-resolution photographs showing substandard work that had somehow passed city inspection. But it was the final section of the report that nearly made me sick to my stomach. Sandra had discovered that Southwest Premier had been operating under multiple contractor licenses, using different license numbers for different projects to avoid triggering automatic reviews that would have revealed their pattern of violations. Even more damning was evidence that they'd been falsifying inspection reports, submitting documentation claiming that electrical and plumbing work had been approved by licensed professionals who had never actually visited the job sites. It was systematic fraud on a scale that went far beyond cutting corners or bending rules. This was deliberate deception that put public safety at risk. I immediately called Sandra back, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. I need to understand the scope of this investigation. Are you saying that Southwest Premier has been systematically fraudulent in their compliance reporting? That's exactly what I'm saying, Sandra replied grimly. And based on the patterns we're seeing, this isn't incompetence or oversight. This is intentional circumvention of safety regulations. We're talking about potential criminal charges if we can establish willful intent to defraud. The implications hit me like a freight train. Diego's entire business success was built on a foundation of lies and fraud. All those projects he'd completed on time and under budget, he'd achieved those results by skipping essential safety measures and falsifying compliance documentation. The company that had made him a local hero was actually a criminal enterprise that had been putting Mesa Verde residents at risk for months. But there was more. Sandra had discovered that Southwest Premier's Sunset Ridge development proposal contained falsified environmental impact studies and fabricated soil analysis reports. The impressive documentation that had convinced investors and city council members was largely fiction, created to hide the fact that the proposed site had significant geological instability that would make high-rise construction extremely dangerous. Ms. Martinez, I need to ask you directly. Have you approved any permits for Southwest Premier's Sunset Ridge project? No, I said quickly. I've been requesting additional information and compliance documentation. The application is still under review. Thank God, Sandra said, with obvious relief. Because approving that project based on their fraudulent documentation could have resulted in a catastrophic structural failure. We're talking about potential loss of life. After ending the call, I sat in my office for nearly an hour, trying to process what I'd learned. My brother, the charming entrepreneur who'd convinced our entire family that I was jealous and obstructionist, was actually running a criminal operation. Every criticism he'd leveled at me about being too rigid and rule-focused had been projection, an attempt to deflect attention from his own systematic violations of the very rules designed to protect public safety. I thought back to all the times Diego had dismissed building codes as bureaucratic nonsense, all the occasions when he'd accused me of prioritizing paperwork over progress. Now I understood that those weren't philosophical differences about the role of regulation, they were the complaints of someone who knew he was breaking the law and resented anyone who might catch him. The most sickening realization was how close I'd come to compromising my principles under pressure from the city council and my family. If I'd given in to the political pressure and found a way to expedite Diego's project approval, I would have been complicit in approving a development that could have killed people. My stubborn insistence on following proper procedures hadn't been obstructionism, it had been the only thing standing between Mesa Verde and a potential disaster. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with Sandra Mitchell and the state investigation team. They needed copies of all permit applications Southwest Premier had submitted to Mesa Verde, along with documentation of our inspection processes and communication records. Most importantly, they needed assurance that no additional permits would be approved for Diego's company while the criminal investigation proceeded. That evening, I faced a decision that would define not just my professional future but my relationship with my family forever. I could quietly cooperate with the state investigation and let the authorities handle Diego's prosecution, keeping my role in his downfall as discreet as possible. Or I could take immediate action to protect Mesa Verde residents by publicly revoking Southwest Premier's contractor licenses and halting all their active projects. The choice was actually simple. Every day that Diego's company continued operating was another day that substandard work was putting people at risk. Every project they completed using fraudulent documentation was another potential disaster waiting to happen. My personal relationships couldn't take priority over public safety. I drafted an emergency order suspending Southwest Premier's operating licenses, effective immediately. All active projects would be shut down pending safety inspections, and the company would be prohibited from submitting new permit applications until the state investigation was complete. I included citations of specific code violations documented in Sandra's report, making it clear that this wasn't a personal vendetta but a response to documented safety violations. Before I could lose my nerve, I emailed the order to Patricia Reynolds, the city council members, and our public information officer. I also sent copies to the Mesa Verde Tribune and the Building Inspectors Union, ensuring that the information would become public immediately and couldn't be suppressed for political reasons. My phone started ringing within minutes. The first call was from Patricia Reynolds, her voice tight with anger and barely controlled panic. "Jessica, what the hell have you done? Do you have any idea what this is going to do to the city's relationship with the development community?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the fight I knew was coming. "Patricia, Southwest Premier has been systematically violating building codes and falsifying inspection reports. This isn't about development relationships. This is about preventing potential loss of life. You should have consulted with me before taking such drastic action. This makes the entire planning department look incompetent. Actually, it makes the planning department look like we're doing our job. I have documentation from the State Building Safety Department proving systematic fraud. This order is legally justified and morally necessary." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Patricia making thinly veiled threats about my future employment and demanding that I find a way to reverse the suspension order. But I knew that the documentation from Sandra's investigation made my position unassailable. Diego's company had been caught red-handed, and no amount of political pressure could change that reality. The second call was from Diego himself, and his voice was unlike anything I'd heard from him before, raw, desperate, and filled with a rage that bordered on incoherent. "You fucking destroyed me, Jessica. You destroyed everything I built because you couldn't stand seeing me succeed. Diego, your company has been systematically violating building codes and falsifying safety reports. People could have died because of the corners you cut. That's bullshit, and you know it. You've been looking for an excuse to sabotage my business since day one, and now you've found it." But even as he screamed accusations and threats, I could hear something else in his voice, the sound of someone who knew he'd been caught and was desperately trying to deflect blame. The confident entrepreneur who'd humiliated me at Thanksgiving was gone, replaced by a cornered criminal who was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The news of Southwest Premier's suspension hit Mesa Verde like an earthquake. By 7 the next morning, the story was front-page news in the Tribune, with the headline "Major Construction Company Suspended for Safety Violations" dominating the local coverage. The article detailed the state investigation findings, the emergency suspension order, and the potential criminal charges facing Diego's company. What shocked me was how quickly the narrative shifted once the truth became public. The same business leaders who had been pressuring me to expedite Diego's permits were now rushing to distance themselves from Southwest Premier. Chamber of Commerce President Linda Walsh, who had criticized my adversarial approach just weeks earlier, issued a statement praising the planning department's commitment to public safety. The transformation was both vindicating and nauseating. These people had been ready to sacrifice safety standards for economic development when they thought Diego was a legitimate businessman. But the moment criminal fraud was exposed, they repositioned themselves as champions of regulatory compliance. My phone didn't stop ringing all morning. Reporters wanted statements about the investigation, City council members demanded briefings on the scope of the violations, and contractors throughout the region called to assure me that their own work met all applicable standards. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also proof that my decision to act decisively had been correct. The most satisfying call came from Marcus Chen, Diego's business partner who had sat in my office months earlier, assuring me that their permit irregularities were minor oversights. His voice was barely above a whisper when I answered. "Miss Martinez, I need you to know that I had no idea about the falsified documents. Diego handled all the compliance paperwork, and he told me everything was being done properly. I never would have participated if I'd known about the fraud." Marcus, ignorance isn't a defense when you're dealing with public safety issues. You signed off on projects without verifying that proper inspections had been completed. I know. I'm cooperating fully with the state investigation, and I've already hired a lawyer. I just wanted you to understand that not everyone at Southwest Premier was part of Diego's scheme. After hanging up, I realized that Diego had been manipulating his own partners just as effectively as he'd manipulated our family. Marcus and Ryan Thompson had been useful covers for his fraudulent activities, providing technical credibility while Diego handled the administrative details that turned out to be systematic deception. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my office. Ryan Thompson, Southwest Premier's third partner, arrived without an appointment, looking haggard and desperate. Unlike Marcus, who seemed genuinely shocked by the fraud revelations, Ryan had the demeanor of someone who'd been carrying a guilty secret for months. "I need to tell you something," he said, slumping into the chair across from my desk. "About Diego and the way he's been operating the company. I should have come forward months ago." Ryan's confession painted an even darker picture of Diego's activities. He described a systematic pattern of bribery and corruption that went far beyond falsified inspection reports. Diego had been paying off building inspectors to overlook code violations, offering cash payments and expensive gifts in exchange for signed approval documents. More troubling was Ryan's account of how Diego had been targeting specific projects for fraud. The Sunset Ridge development wasn't just another construction job. It was part of an elaborate scheme to defraud investors and insurance companies. Diego had been inflating project costs, skimming money from material purchases, and planning to use substandard construction materials while charging premium prices. He told us the investors were sophisticated people who understood that construction projects sometimes required creative solutions, Ryan said, using air quotes with obvious disgust. He made it sound like we were just being efficient, not criminals. But the most shocking revelation was Diego's backup plan. Ryan had discovered that Diego had been secretly negotiating with out-of-state contractors to take over Southwest Premier's projects if local authorities became too difficult to manage. He'd been prepared to abandon Mesa Verde entirely, leaving behind a trail of unsafe buildings and defrauded investors while starting fresh in another state. "He's not the charming entrepreneur everyone thinks he is," Ryan said quietly. "He's a sociopath who uses people until they're no longer useful, then discards them without a second thought." As Ryan left my office, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Everything I'd suspected about Diego's character had been confirmed, but learning the full extent of his deception was still painful. The brother who'd grown up in the same house, attended the same family gatherings, and shared the same parents had become someone I barely recognized. The next few days brought a steady stream of revelations as the state investigation expanded. Sandra Mitchell's team discovered that Southwest Premier's fraud extended to at least 4 other municipalities in the region, with a pattern of violations dating back nearly 2 years. Diego hadn't just been cutting corners on a few projects, he'd built an entire business model around systematic deception. The financial fraud was staggering. State auditors estimated that Diego had collected over $3 million in payments for work that didn't meet code requirements, while simultaneously billing investors for materials and labor that were never provided. The Sunset Ridge development alone involved nearly $500,000 in fraudulent documentation and inflated cost estimates. But the human cost was even more disturbing. Engineers brought in to assess Southwest Premier's completed projects found structural deficiencies that posed immediate safety risks. The restaurant downtown had to be evacuated when inspectors discovered that Diego's electrical work had created fire hazards that could have killed dozens of people. The office complex required emergency structural reinforcement to prevent partial collapse during the next significant earthquake. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after I'd issued the suspension order, Diego was arrested at his apartment on charges of construction fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and endangering public safety. The arrest was covered extensively by local media, with footage of Diego being led away in handcuffs playing on repeat during the evening news broadcasts. I watched the coverage from my living room, feeling a strange emptiness rather than the satisfaction I'd expected. This was my brother being destroyed by the consequences of his own actions, but seeing him reduced to a criminal defendant was still painful. The confident entrepreneur who'd humiliated me at Thanksgiving had been replaced by a frightened man who could barely make eye contact with the cameras. The family reaction was swift and predictable. My mother called within hours of Diego's arrest, her voice thick with tears and recrimination. "How could you do this to your own brother? How could you destroy his life over some paperwork issues?" "Mom, this isn't about paperwork. Diego was committing fraud and putting people's lives at risk. Buildings could have collapsed. People could have died. That's ridiculous. Diego would never do anything to hurt anyone. You've always been jealous of his success, and now you've finally found a way to destroy him." The conversation was a painful reminder that some people would never accept the truth, no matter how overwhelming the evidence became. My mother had invested so much of her identity in Diego's success that acknowledging his criminality would require admitting her own fundamental misjudgment of his character. My father's reaction was more nuanced, but equally hurtful. He called later that evening, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Midja, I understand you had to do your job, but couldn't you have found a way to handle this privately? Did it have to become such a public spectacle?" "Dad, this wasn't about family disputes. This was about criminal activity that was putting the entire community at risk. I couldn't cover up fraud just because Diego is my brother." I know. It's just, this is going to destroy our family. People are going to be talking about this for years." The conversation revealed something I'd suspected for a long time. My parents cared more about public perception than public safety. They were more concerned about the family's reputation than the fact that Diego's actions could have killed innocent people. But not everyone in the family shared that perspective. My cousin Sarah called that weekend with a very different message. "Jessica, I just wanted you to know that some of us understand what you did and why you had to do it. It took incredible courage to stand up to all that pressure and do the right thing." "Thank you. That means more than you know. I've been hearing things about Diego for months, rumors about how he was doing business, complaints from subcontractors who weren't getting paid properly. A lot of us suspected something wasn't right, but nobody wanted to rock the boat." Sarah's call was a reminder that truth has a way of revealing itself, even when powerful people try to suppress it. The signs of Diego's fraud had been visible to anyone who looked carefully, but the combination of family loyalty and economic self-interest had created a conspiracy of silence that allowed him to operate unchecked for months. 6 months after Diego's arrest, I stood in the conference room of the Mesa Verde City Hall, looking out at a packed audience that had gathered for the monthly Planning Commission meeting. The contrast with that hostile city council meeting from the previous year couldn't have been more dramatic. Instead of angry developers and frustrated business owners demanding that I expedite questionable projects, the room was filled with architects, contractors, and community leaders who had come to discuss new safety protocols and transparency measures. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the Southwest Premier scandal, Mesa Verde had to confront some uncomfortable truths about how easily our community had been deceived by Diego's charm and false promises. The state investigation had revealed systematic failures in our oversight processes, and implementing meaningful reforms required acknowledging that our previous approach to development oversight had been dangerously inadequate. My role in exposing Diego's fraud had fundamentally changed my position within both the city government and the broader community. Patricia Reynolds, who had pressured me to expedite Diego's project approval, now regularly cited my dedication to safety standards in her speeches about municipal governance. City council members who had once viewed me as an obstacle to economic development now sought my input on policy decisions and regulatory reforms. The professional recognition was gratifying, but it came with new responsibilities that extended far beyond Mesa Verde. The California Association of Planning Officials had invited me to chair a statewide committee on construction fraud prevention, and I'd been asked to speak at conferences across the region about identifying and preventing systematic violations of building codes. Most significantly, the state legislature had passed new legislation requiring enhanced oversight of construction projects, with several provisions directly based on recommendations I'd developed in response to the Southwest Premier case. The Martinez Protocol, as it had become known, established mandatory cross-verification of inspection reports and created whistleblower protections for municipal employees who reported suspected fraud. But the personal cost of exposing Diego's crimes had been substantial and lasting. Our family remained fractured, with my parents maintaining their belief that I had betrayed my brother out of jealousy and professional ambition. They had attended every day of Diego's trial, sitting in the front row as visible symbols of support, while he was convicted on 17 counts of fraud and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. The trial itself had been a surreal experience. Watching Diego in an orange jumpsuit, listening to prosecutors detail his systematic deception and manipulation, I kept searching for traces of the charming brother I'd grown up with. But the person sitting at the defendant's table seemed like a stranger, calculating, unrepentant, and completely focused on minimizing his own responsibility for the harm he'd caused. During his sentencing hearing, Diego was given an opportunity to address the court. I'd hoped he might express genuine remorse for the safety risks he'd created or acknowledge the damage his actions had caused to our family and community. Instead, he delivered a self-serving speech about how he'd been trying to bring economic opportunity to Mesa Verde and had been unfairly persecuted by vindictive government officials who didn't understand the realities of modern business. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at me as he spoke, "I made some mistakes in my documentation and oversight processes, but my intentions were always to serve this community and create opportunities for local workers. The prosecution of this case has been driven more by personal grudges than public interest." Even facing prison time, Diego couldn't accept responsibility for his actions. He'd convinced himself that his fraud was justified by his entrepreneurial vision, and that anyone who opposed him was motivated by jealousy or small-minded bureaucratic thinking. The self-awareness that might have led to genuine redemption simply wasn't there. The aftermath of Diego's conviction had required difficult decisions about how to move forward with relationships that had been fundamentally damaged by his actions and my response to them. Some family members, like my cousin Sarah, had ultimately acknowledged that I'd done the right thing in exposing Diego's fraud. But others, including my parents and several aunts and uncles, maintained their belief that family loyalty should have trumped professional obligations. The breaking point came during a family gathering 8 months after Diego's sentencing. My mother had organized a fundraiser to help pay for Diego's legal appeals, and she'd expected me to contribute both money and public support for his case. When I politely declined, explaining that I couldn't ethically support efforts to overturn a conviction based on evidence I'd helped develop, the confrontation was swift and brutal. "You've chosen your career over your family," my mother said, her voice cold with finality. "Don't expect us to pretend that's acceptable, or to welcome you at family events where you're not wanted." The ultimatum was clear: either support Diego's appeals and publicly acknowledge that I'd been wrong to expose his fraud, or accept permanent estrangement from most of my extended family. The choice was painful but not difficult. I couldn't compromise my integrity or public safety for the sake of family harmony, even if that meant accepting isolation from people I'd loved my entire life. But the personal losses were balanced by unexpected gains. The professional recognition had led to new friendships with colleagues who shared my commitment to ethical governance and public safety. I'd also reconnected with old friends from college who'd reached out after seeing news coverage of the Southwest Premier case, expressing admiration for my willingness to stand up to political pressure and family expectations. Most importantly, I'd discovered a sense of purpose and self-respect that had been missing during all those years of trying to balance family loyalty with professional integrity. The constant pressure to compromise my standards for Diego's benefit was gone, replaced by clear boundaries and consistent principles that guided both my personal and professional decisions. The city of Mesa Verde had also emerged stronger from the Southwest Premier scandal. The enhanced oversight protocols had attracted responsible developers who appreciated working in a jurisdiction with clear, consistently enforced standards. Property values had actually increased as buyers gained confidence in the quality and safety of local construction projects. We'd also seen an influx of conscientious contractors who viewed our rigorous inspection processes as a competitive advantage rather than an obstacle. These were professionals who understood that thorough compliance review protected both their reputations and their clients' safety, and they welcomed the opportunity to work in a market where cutting corners wasn't tolerated. 1 year after Diego's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from him in prison. I'd had no contact with him since the trial, and seeing his familiar handwriting on the envelope brought back a flood of complicated emotions. Part of me hoped the letter might contain the genuine apology and acceptance of responsibility that had been absent from his court statements. Instead, Diego's letter was a mixture of self-pity and continued manipulation. He wrote about the harsh conditions in prison, the unfairness of his sentence, and his plans to rebuild his life once he was released. But there was no acknowledgement of the harm his actions had caused, no recognition of the safety risks he'd created, and no genuine remorse for the damage to our family relationships. The letter concluded with a request that hurt more than anything he'd said during our worst confrontations. I hope you'll be willing to help me get back on my feet when I get out. I know we've had our differences, but family should stick together through tough times. Even after everything that had happened, Diego still believed he could manipulate me into supporting him. He still saw his fraud conviction as a temporary setback, rather than the natural consequence of serious crimes, and he still expected family loyalty to override moral and legal obligations. I wrote back once, explaining that I hoped he would use his time in prison to develop genuine insight into his actions and their consequences, but that any future relationship would depend on his willingness to accept full responsibility for the harm he'd caused. I never received a response, and I haven't heard from him since. Today, as I prepare for another planning commission meeting, I'm reminded of how dramatically my life has changed since that first conversation with Diego about his construction company. I'm still the same person who believes in the importance of regulatory oversight and public safety, but I'm no longer willing to compromise those principles for the sake of maintaining relationships with people who don't share my values. The title "family loser" that Diego had used to humiliate me has taken on a different meaning. If being a loser means refusing to enable criminal behavior, choosing professional integrity over family pressure, and prioritizing public safety over personal relationships, then I'm proud to accept that label. The real losers in this story are the people who chose loyalty to a criminal over commitment to their community, who valued the illusion of family harmony more than the reality of public safety, and who still believe that blood relations should provide immunity from the consequences of harmful actions. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal comes at enormous personal cost. Discovered that the respect of ethical colleagues and the satisfaction of meaningful work can provide a foundation for happiness that doesn't depend on the approval of people who don't share your fundamental values. Mesa Verde is safer because I chose principles over popularity, and I sleep better at night knowing that my decisions have protected innocent people from potential harm. That's worth more than any family relationship built on a foundation of lies and enabled by willful blindness to harmful behavior. The construction continues in Mesa Verde, but now it's happening safely, transparently, and in accordance with standards that protect everyone who will live and work in the buildings we approve. And that's the kind of legacy I'm proud to build. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.